Mhm. Okay, Caitlin, does that look right? Perfect. It kept my settings this time. Okay. Caitlin, do you see it recording on your end? Just want to double check. Okay, it's recording to the cloud.
You're
I
good.
see it. Perfect. All right. So my name is Amy Barkley. I am the livestock and beginning farm specialist with the Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops program. Our program is a partnership between Cornell Cooperative Extension and the 5 county regions that we serve. So we serve Erie, Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, Allegheny, and Steuben counties. And our job is to take information from Cornell University and bring it to you all. So thank you for joining us today. I work on a team with 3 other specialists. We have a farm business management specialist, Caitlin Wally-Stoll, who's my partner here in this workshop series. I'll have her introduce herself in 1 second. We also have a forage and field crop specialist, Caitlin Miller, and a dairy specialist named Camila Lodge. And together we serve the farmers of Southwest New York. So with that said, I'll introduce myself. Besides my work job, I also have a small farm in Western New York. We're a diversified operation. We've got a little bit of everything. I'm focusing on heritage poultry, market garden, orchard, and apiary. And then in my work life, I work with all things livestock. So pasture management, livestock production and management, quality and consistency of products, and of course, beginning farmer support. So Caitlin, I am going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everybody. I'm Caitlin Wally-Stoll, and I'm our program's farm business management specialist. I've been with Cooperative Extension for about 10 years now. The reason that I'm here is my husband and I have a small diversified livestock farm, which basically means that we started out as beef farmers, and I kept bringing other things home. And one of those other things was goats. So we've been raising goats for 12 years now. And have had a lot of ups and downs and trials and tribulations. So happy to help provide Amy with support. I'm also going to be running some of the tech stuff in the background tonight. So if you run into any issues or get disconnected, please don't hesitate to reach out and we'll help get you back here again.
Thanks, Caitlin. And Caitlin has a really wide experience in the goat realm that is invaluable. And a lot of these videos that you'll see, she's helped record them, and she's actually teaching some portions of the program here coming up. So it's not all me, and I really appreciate her support here. So thank you, Caitlin. If you have any technical difficulties, you can go ahead and reach out to either of us via our cell phones. Just because when we have the presentations up, we can't see email very well. So if you want to go ahead and text Caitlin, should you have any issues tonight, 716-640-0522, that is perfect. And before we get started, we want to thank the Cornell Small Farms Farm Ops program. This is a veteran program put on by Cornell Small Farms. They actually helped develop this program. They provide some financial support so that we could get these video recordings to integrate within the webinar series to highlight some of the more technical aspects of what we'll be talking about. And we did present a very similar presentation last year, and we're really happy to have had their support so that we could provide it to you this year. And just a small disclaimer, the information that we provide here is accurate and up to date as to our knowledge. It is not a substitute for sound legal counsel or veterinary advice. Those are the 2 things we're primarily going to be covering. So please get a hold of those folks should you have very specific questions about those 2 subject matters. And with that, buying a goat. So today we're going to talk about selecting breeds, numbers, genders, where you purchase them. We're going to talk about health status a little bit. So some things like how to look at a body condition score to, decide whether or not you're buying an animal that is going to perform well for you. Good feet, disease considerations. We're going to talk about the most common diseases that we see in goats here in New York State. We're going to talk about quarantining and integrating anything new that you buy, and the financial considerations and record keeping of a goat operation, whether that be for a hobby or for a business. But first, we're going to start with a poll. And throughout this presentation, we have 5 of these. And I will go ahead and throw up the poll. And you can go ahead and answer it, and then we'll post the results live. It's all anonymous, so answer as you'd like. The first one is, tell us who you are and where you are in your goat journey. So is there already a goat in your garage? Are you close to raising goats, but not quite there? Do you want a little bit more information on raising goats before you make the jump? Or, I don't know why I'm here. I signed up for the wrong webinar. So we'll give that a couple more seconds. Okay. So it looks like we have a wide variety joining us tonight, which I'm really excited about. So hopefully all of you will be able to take little bits of information back with you and make some decisions as to your new goat enterprise. Okay. So selecting your breed. Selecting your breed is something that I can advise you towards, but I can't help with. It's all going to be based on what your goals are. A meat goat is going to grow differently than a milk goat. It's going to grow differently than a fiber goat. They're going to have different breed characteristics. They're going to have different muscling. They're going to have different maturity times. They're going to have different fiber types. And in addition to this, there are some considerations for efficiency of gain. So even within different breeds of goats, you're going to have ones that gain weight better if they're meat goats. You're going to have dairy goats that produce a higher percentage of milk fat, that sort of thing. We sometimes look at our breeds and whether or not they're selected for pasture or barn management, and that's not necessarily a breed thing, but an individual herd thing. So if you're buying from a herd, just say that's managed in a certain way with principles that you're going to employ on your farm, those animals may have a little bit of a jump start when they come to your property and undergo that management style. Purebreds versus hybrids. I think there's a lot of value in hybrids, quite frankly, because when we breed purebreds, we end up sometimes with really great stuff, but we also end up with some of the little genetic idiosyncrasies that can happen when we breed a line for a long time. There's a thing called hybrid vigor for a reason. So crossing two different lines together to get an animal that has better characteristics than either of its parents, while also exhibiting a combination of characteristics from both of the parents. And finally, the final consideration is whether you want to go show versus commercial. So show animals are typically bred to a standard of a breed type. And that's just that they look pretty, whether that be they have a nice round udder, whether that be they have a really nice round body if they're a meat animal, or they have really nice fiber characteristics. But sometimes having a commercial line, so a line that has been bred on purpose to exaggerate the qualities that we're looking for a meat, milk, or fiber animal, might be what you're going for. But like I said, it's all going to depend on a goal. It's highly unlikely that a commercial goat's going to score tops at the fair, but it might. You never know. We're going to talk about milk producing animals first, since they seem to be really picking up speed and popularity here in New York State. So when you're looking at a group of goats, milk producing goats are typically taller. They have more leg to them, and they look a little on the skinny side generally. They're not as fleshed out. Generally, these animals are from a line of milk producers. So if you're purchasing them from a breeder or from another farm, they'll tell you, yes, we've been milking them for this many years, or yes, they're bred to produce milk rather than meat. Disposition is typically quite important with milking goats because you're standing under their legs and you're milking them. So they've got to be tolerant of that process. Some animals are more tolerant than others, and it's all going to be personality of individuals more so than personality of an entire breed. When you're going to buy animals that are destined for milk production, you can buy them one of two ways. You can buy young ones. So those have been weaned off their parents. Those are typically called doelings, and we don't need to worry about pregnancy with those typically. So you can buy them, raise them until they're breeding age, go ahead and breed them, and then get milk that way. You can also buy an older doe, so a doe that maybe has had a kid before, and maybe she's not pregnant, maybe she is. If she's not pregnant, she's called open, and she may be accepting of a male at some time during the breeding season, or she may be pregnant. So if she is, get an idea from the previous owner of how far along she is so that you're not terribly surprised when a kid drops to the ground. And then after giving birth, she will immediately start her lactation. The gestation period of a goat is 150 days from the time of insemination and taking of that embryo. And that goat will produce milk for 9 to 10 months. Goats are managed a lot like dairy cattle in that they milk for a long period of time, and you can choose to milk them 1 or 2 times a day. If you milk them once a day, sometimes you can get away with keeping the kid on the dam so that you don't have to bottle feed a baby. But if you want a little bit more milk, maybe you'd consider milking them twice a day. And you could do that by either hand or machine. It's entirely up to you. Hand is obviously more involved, but machine involves a $1,000 to $2,000 investment of a pumping machine. So something to consider there. And then the question I always ask folks who are just getting into dairy is, okay, so you're going to get a dairy goat, but what are you going to do with all that milk? And we'll talk about milk in a couple of slides from now in terms of the volumes that you can expect. These are just a few of the different breeds of milk producers that are out there. Quite frankly, a lot that I'm seeing now are crosses. There are some purebreds out there. Again, just talk to those folks who are selling them to figure that out. But Alpines, La Manchas, Nigerians, Nubians, Oberhalsey, Saanen, Sable, and Toggenburg are 8 of the different varieties that are very common in this area that produce good amounts of milk. They're from different parts of the world. Some are from Africa, some are from the US. Some of them are Swiss. A lot of them are Swiss, actually. But the preference there is up to you. This is that breed comparison chart that has the milk volumes on it, if you're curious. I'm not going to go through this whole chart, but you'll see breed along the left-hand side, average milk production in pounds in the next column over. Now, this is per lactation. So this is for that 9-10 months that you're going to go ahead and milk that goat. I believe because this is from National Milk Dairy Goat Forum, this information is for a twice-a-day milking. So the lactation range you can see is pretty wide for most of these goats, probably depending on where you are in the country, what they're being fed, how often they're being milked. And then you have milk fat percentages. And this actually varies quite a bit, as well as pounds of milk. So for instance, I want to draw your attention to the breed that's 3 down, the Nigerian Dwarf. Nigerian Dwarfs are very interesting in that they produce a very small amount of milk relative to their other goat counterparts because they're a very small goat. But they do produce what we call high components, so high amounts of milk fat, high amounts of milk protein. But as you go down this chart, you can see there is variation, and there are other breeds that produce pretty high milk fat and protein versus the average. Next, I'm going to talk about udder and teat conformation. If your doe is in milk when you purchase her, or if she is pregnant, ready to kid, it's going to be much easier to see the udder and teat conformation versus if she's dry or open. When that happens, her udder is going to be sucked up against her body, and you'll see some of the form of it, but it's not going to be as pronounced as if they're, milking or close to milking. So a normal udder and teat is so it's dual lateral. So you have one on the right, one on the left, 1 quarter and 1 teat. And the teats should both be functional. They should not be hanging any lower than the middle of the back legs. And those teats should be nice and rounded with the udders teats facing down in general. Now, this is some abnormal stuff. And what these pictures show, so the first one on the left is bottle teats. And these are a little difficult to manage because it's hard to put a milking machine on them. Milking by hand is a little bit better for these girls. But what's also a challenge is that kids will have a really hard time suckling off of these mamas, especially if you're leaving the kids on as part of your management technique. And that's just because they physically can't get their mouth around that huge teat canal to suckle. And a lot of those babies, unless you teach them to suckle from udders like this, will become bottle babies. But many will become bottle babies anyway, just because they can't get milk otherwise. The other abnormal conformation is this bad udder structure is what it's called. So in the previous picture, we saw that the udder was tight and up above the middle of the back legs. In this particular goat, you can see that her ligaments, I think, are a little weaker, or she's just built this way. So she may be an older goat. It's hard to say, but For the purposes of this demonstration, let's pretend she's a young goat. This is not great because her udder is very low. It's going to snag on things as she walks around. It'll become sore. She'll have a hard time accepting you milking her because it'll hurt. And this is very difficult to get kids to suckle on because the teats are not because they're too wide, but because they're so low to the ground. Typically with these goats, you'll have to teach kids how to suckle off of their mom by bending their legs and putting their head up, and it's a whole thing. So if you have a choice, I would avoid does like this. So here are some teat defects to look out for. Normally these teat defects aren't going to do much, but they may interfere with milking equipment. They may interfere with how you milk the goat, and they may result in mastitis depending on how well they're formed. If they're formed with a teat canal and it's open and it maybe produces some milk because there's some sort of mammary component attached, that can be a problem. But small teat spurs like the picture on the left typically aren't a huge deal, but they are a defect. This is a double teat on a doe in the middle picture, and on the right picture, not great. It's called a fish teat, essentially where the teat splits during development. So those does are going to be hard to milk. This is a line of does that was published by the American Dairy Goat Association. So this is kind of like the standard of pretty in terms of goat teats. So while the bag on these goat, I'm going to show you this goat all the way on the left side of the picture just to illustrate like what's good about her. So not only does she have a really large milk bag, which indicates that she's probably a high producing animal, but you can see that even though her milk bag is very, very large, it's attached as high up onto her body as it can get. So none of that hanging, swinging, ground dragging udder that we saw a couple of slides ago. Her teats are also nice and long and fairly tubular, so not bulbous and swollen where a kid couldn't get under, where you can't get a milking machine on her. So this is a pretty prime example of a dairy goat. And honestly, everybody in this picture is pretty prime. Milk bags differ in size, but they all look good in terms of teat structure. Okay, and before I switch over to milk goats, I should have said in the beginning, if you have questions as we go along, please pop them into the chat box, and I will pause at the end of every section, check in with Caitlin, see if we've got any questions, and go ahead and answer those live. So I will do that right now. I will say, okay, let's take a small check-in. Let's see if we have any questions on dairy goats.
We're doing okay. We had one question asking, or just kind of clarifying what line meant. So a line of goats doesn't mean that they're all related. It just means that they are a group of goats that might have similar characteristics.
Yes.
So they can be related, but typically it's just a similar grouping. So that answer was dropped in the chat. And that's all we have so far. So oh, we have one more that just came in. How can you keep the kid with mom while still milking once a day?
Yeah, so that management style, what I've typically seen, I haven't done it, but what I've typically seen in other goat herds, please drop your experience into the chat if you have this experience, is that they will leave the kid on mom all day long and then take the kid off at night with a bunch of other kids so the kid doesn't, so it's not lonely. And then overnight, mom will swell up, she'll engorge, she'll be ready to milk in the morning. And then once she's done milking, you put her out with the baby can then get the rest of the milk for the rest of the day. So that's a typical way that folks do that.
When growing up, we had dairy goats, and what we would do is we would just kind of bring everybody into the barn and milk the mom while the kid was still running around. And as long as you are consistently milking at similar times and for like the same length of time until their udders are emptied out, it'll signal to that doe's body to produce more milk, and that will be more milk than what that kid is going to eat. The advantage of doing a system like that is that you get massive kids because their moms are producing more milk than the kids need anyway. So you can do it that way if you don't want to separate kids out, particularly if it's just for like supplemental milk for you to use in your home or for small projects.
That's a good point. Thanks, Caitlin.
Yeah.
All right.
Looks like that's all the questions for right now, Amy.
Super. Thanks. All right. So let's talk meat goats. Meat goats are generally, I call them the football players of the goat world. They're still on the skinny side because they're goats, but they've got more fleshing on them. So they're a little stockier. They've got shorter legs typically. Even when they come into milk, they don't have a huge milk bag. And typically these animals are bred on purpose for higher carcass weights and carcass yield. So the amount of meat that you get off the animal in addition to the size of the animal. With these animals, we're not milking them every day, and we're typically not handling them every day. So disposition is a little less important. However, you typically don't want animals that are really spooky. You got to think about if you've got small kids at home, if you've got a livestock guardian dog at home, that sort of thing. How will these goats adapt? And again, that's something that you can look into with the person that you may be interested in purchasing from. Say, hey, have these goats had exposure to X, Y, and Z? Or hey, are these goats nervous or are they generally not nervous? And that can help you that way. Color and body type can be important, and this is really interesting. So there are some groups of folks that like to buy live goats, and those folks that buy live goats typically like them to look a certain way. Sometimes that means that they have their horns left on. Sometimes that means they have that they are not castrated. And sometimes that means they look exactly like a boar goat, which is what you see in this image. So I would take a look into your markets prior to getting goats if you're looking to do this on a larger scale, and make sure that you choose animals that are going to meet what your market is expecting. We can change castration and dehorning, like that's easy for us to change as managers, but we can't exactly change the genetics of a goat. The four most common breeds of goats here in the US are Boer, Spanish, Kiko, and Savannah. Each has their pros and cons. Generally, goats are susceptible to parasites. So if you have goats that are purebred for meat, typically there are some more resistant lines versus less resistant lines. And when you crossbreed them, you usually end up with higher resistance to parasites and better hoof health. So those are two things that we're going to expand more upon in different videos here. So hoof health a little bit later today and parasites later on in another class. But that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at meat goats. You can also see that there is some variation from goat type to goat type here in terms of body shape. And that's just because of how they were bred and what they were bred from. So some of them, I believe the Spanish and Savannah, I think the Spanish for sure. That's one of those goats that's a bush breed. So people went out, they found the goat in the wild and they were like, yeah, we want this and we want to breed it. And so it's kind of a more scrubby, rough and tumble type looking goat versus a boar, which was more purposely bred for meat production and a Kiko and that sort of thing. So that all said, genetics vary quite a bit between even the four breeds of meat goats that you'll find here. And sometimes you'll find some dairy goats mixed into meat goats, which brings up some benefits of hybrids. We talked about hybrid vigor a little bit earlier, but just say you have meat goats and you have challenges with, you have multiple kids being born, but not enough milk for them. So one of the ways that you could fix that is you could bring in a milk goat genetic in order to increase the udder size and capacity on a female goat, you know, the meat cross goats that you have, in order to produce more milk for your babies and get higher weaning weights. So that's one thing that we can think of. Another thing to think of is that dairy goat offspring, typically we keep the females and they're going to be our highest value replacements or to sell. But the baby males are actually, they can grow up to be pretty good meat goats, in addition to being companion wethers if you choose to go that route, or breeders if you choose to go that route. But typically they're used as dual purpose animals and they don't produce as much as a meat goat, but they do pretty well. Okay, I'm going to go through fiber goats and then I'll pause and ask if we have any questions. So, because fiber goats is a little shorter here. Fiber goats are obviously goats that are bred for fiber production. You can keep males or females typically for this. They are higher in management. So those that have fiber goats typically are very cautious about where they put their feeders, for instance, to make sure that they're not throwing hay on their backs. They're conscientious of when they're let outside to avoid getting a lot of rain in their coats. And generally they need a really high plane of nutrition. So that means a lot of protein, a lot of vitamins and minerals at a ratio that may be different from that of a meat goat, for instance, in order to get that optimal fiber quality. Fiber quality does decline as the animal ages, so something to consider, and it is different from animal to animal and within lines of different types of goats. So we talk about cashmeres. They are a type rather than a breed, but cashmeres refer to any animal, any goats that produce long fibered animals with very few rough hairs in between. So something that is made to produce fiber. Angoras are another one that we see quite often. And they have different kinds of fiber, kinky fiber, colored fiber, straight fiber. It's just going to depend on what you want as to which breeder you select for these animals. All right, so that was my 30,000 foot overview of goat breeds, just because if we got into it, it would take a long time. So I'll stop and pause and ask, are there any questions about the 3 different classes of goats?
It doesn't look like we have any yet, Amy.
Cool, sounds good.
Okay.
So we'll go ahead and move on to reproductive characteristics. So goats are seasonal breeders and most breed in the fall. And it takes about 12 months or so for a goat to reach full maturity to be ideal breeding age to produce goat kids that have the best weights when born, best weaning weights, etc. That said, there can be accidents. Goats do mature sexually around 4 months of age, or they can around 4 months of age if they have a high plane of nutrition, which means they have a lot of protein and vitamins and energy. And so you may end up with goats earlier than you wanted goats to have babies. That's not great. So we try to aim for that 12 months. Bucks are about 12 months. Does, aim for 12 months, but it's going to be about 60 to 70% of their adult size. And you won't know that until you have had the goats for a while, or you talk with a mentor who has had these type of goats and says, okay, they're at a weight where you can go ahead and breed them. Mothering ability is something important to consider. You want goats to be good mothers, especially if you don't intend on having bottle babies. Some goats, individuals, just really hate motherhood and they will have babies and abandon them, notoriously, litter after litter. Some goats are fantastic mothers. So if you have a choice and you have to work through your herd on genetics and choose those genetics which you want to keep, mothering ability is definitely one to keep. Number of offspring is also inherited. So if you want singles, you can choose goats that have historically had singles. If you want doubles or twins, you can choose for that. Or if you want triplets, typically it's either triplets or twins. Most goats don't have triplets, but sometimes they do. So that's something else you could think of. And then if you want, you can go ahead and select what's called a proven breeder. So these are animals that have had at least one sire service that has been successful if they're males, or they have had one kid or set of kids if they're females. So when we talk about pasture characteristics, there are a couple of camps for this. I'm not going to go into great detail, but goats typically need grain to thrive, especially goats that are producing high producing milk goats or fiber goats. Some goats are bred over many years by some breeders to get all of their nutrition from grass. And if that is your management style, I would strongly suggest finding somebody that has goats that have thrived on grass for many years. So we don't want to take a goat that's been used to grain and kick it out on grass, because it's not going to do very well. Once it gets to your place, it will probably lose weight. Now, goats in general have a very quick digestive system. So what they do is they eat a lot and it goes through pretty quick versus some other large ruminants. So that's why you can let goats into a brushy pasture and they will nibble the most nutritious parts of plants, the little budlets, the little bits of bark, little tips of new growing plants. And by eating a huge bulk of this and it moves through their system pretty quick, they're able to get more nutrition out of it than some of our other species. So Goats are cool like that. Another thing to keep in mind is how you're going to contain your goats. Goats have a tendency to be escape artists, and with that comes great responsibility on the part of the goat herd, especially if you're near a road or especially if you're near predatory habitat like woods, for instance. Sometimes you will need to install sturdy fence with relatively solid walls, whether that be woven wire fence, metal woven wire fence, or some other configuration of fence that's solid. But some goats can be trained to what's called electric netting. So it's this fencing that you see here in this image. It's made up of a plastic woven material with metal fibers running through it that can be electrified. And once goats learn that that's electrified, they typically don't try to challenge it unless they have something drastic change in their environment where, for instance, they're chased by a coyote, and then they may bust through a fence because the shock of that fence to them is a small price to pay to get away from the danger. So if you're looking to put goats out in electric netting, I would strongly suggest training them before you just stick them outside. And another consideration is you may want to disbud or have the horns removed. Usually this happens when the goats are babies, so it is better for their health and well-being if it's done young. But if the animals are disbudded, they have less of a chance to get stuck in electric fence, which would be very bad if they did. All right, so with that, we're going to throw up our second poll, and the question is, which goat are you thinking of? Are you thinking of, thank you, Caitlin, meat goats, fiber goats, dairy goats, a mix, or you're still not sure? And a mix can either be a mixed breed or a mix of goats. I did not make that specific. Okay, so it looks like most of us are a mix of goats or dairy goats, some meat, a few fiber. So very cool. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so let's talk about how many goats and which goats to start off with. Do you want to start with males, females, or fixed individuals? So some terminology for you, because the goat people will throw this around, and I want to make sure you know what you're talking about when you're going to buy goats. So castrated males are called wethers. Uncastrated males are called bucks. If they're young, they're called bucklings. Young does, typically before they've had their first kid, are called doelings. And if you're breeding, I would avoid purchasing bucks and does from related lines. So brothers and sisters, I wouldn't recommend breeding together. So how many do I want to start with? Well, you can theoretically start with one in your backyard. That works. But if you're looking to get a little bit larger than that, and you want to keep a buck on site for breeding, keep in mind that the buck's age is going to influence how many does he's able to service. So a 1-year-old buck will be able to breed about 10 does per month. Typically the estrus cycle in a goat, so the amount of time in between available times for breeding is about a month. So that's why we go by month here. So at 1 year old, he's able to service 10 does. By about 3 years, he's able to service 40 does. So as he gets older, he's more able and better able to provide enough semen to all of those females. When you're starting out, just think about the amount of product that you want to start with for your business. How much are you looking to sell? You don't want to over or underproduce that product. Are you going to be selling the offspring? Are they going to be a co-product of your farm, or are you going to keep them? What's your kidding rate? And depending on that kidding rate, that may influence how many you end up keeping and how many you may end up selling. And like I said, you can buy just one. That's okay. Though I would recommend 2 so that they can pal around. Okay, so where do I get goats? There are a couple of different places. And I have listed these in the order of least risk in terms of disease, getting disease on your farm or homestead, to the most risk. So typically private breeders and commercial farms with what's called closed herds are going to be the safest. Closed herds means that that person gets animals in, And then they don't let any other animals onto the farm unless they are strongly vetted, where they don't have any diseases, they're tested free of diseases, and then they can come onto the farm and integrate with the herd. This is typically the safest because you're working with one group of animals where there's not animals moving in and out. Your next level down is private breeders or commercial farms with open herds. So sometimes these folks will bring goats onto the farm, whether it's extra females because they need to increase their reproductive capacity. Excuse me. It might be a buck that they bring on for breeding season, that sort of thing. So typically they are following practices to keep their animals safe, but they are introducing animals that may or may not have been tested for disease. The next riskiest is Craigslist. And so on Craigslist, there are a lot of people who do a lot of disease testing, know what the disease status is of their herd, and they're a good choice. And there are some that don't. So if you go ahead and use Craigslist or any of the other open ads, just make sure that you are talking to those people and understanding what their disease management strategies are. I'm going to take a 2-second break because I did not bring water up with me and I can't talk. So let's meet back here at 7:39. And so we won't take our mid break like we'll typically do. So we'll just pass by that Kit Kat bar. So please take a minute, get up, stretch, and I will see you in 2 minutes.
Sounds great. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Way too much talking today.
You're doing great.
Thank you.
There was a question that came in asking
Yeah.
about a little bit more about like the pros and cons of disbudding, and clarifying like what the horns purpose is. So I don't know if you want to take that one or if you want me to take that one.
I can, how about I take it and you fill in where you feel
Sounds good.
comfortable.
Sounds
So
good.
disbudding, okay, so disbudding is a process where when the goat kid is born, the horns start to form on like the outside of the skull and then they start growing into the skull. And so when they're very, very young, it's a good idea if you want to remove the horns to do it at that time. And you could do it a bunch of different ways. You can apply a caustic paste, or you could burn them off. Both ways are fine. And essentially what that does is that then removes the horn for the rest of that animal's life. The disadvantage is that goats do use their horns for socialization. So you do remove that from them if you choose to disbud. But the advantages are is that you don't get accidentally injured as a handler. Children and visitors that come onto your farm don't get accidentally injured. And they don't get their head stuck places where they shouldn't get their head stuck. And they don't injure other animals. So there's pros and cons to it, and that decision is going to have to be ultimately made by you.
Yeah, I would just add, and this is like a conversation in our farm management team. I think that we change our minds every day about whether or not we should be disbudding or not. I think for anybody who's worked with cattle before, you can disbud cattle for depending on what method you're using for quite a while after they are born. With goats, however, you really have to be disbudding them when they're less than a week old. Goat horns are more attached to the skull and they grow at the base faster than they grow out versus cow horns. So for our farm, We sometimes make the decision to not disbud because we don't want to put the stress on that kid when they're also just a week old. Depending on the breed of your goat too, most of goat horns will naturally curve backwards. So they are less of a safety issue compared to cattle, right? So cows would be facing out, be more of a concern versus goats that are curving backwards. But as somebody who has one goat right now that refuses to eat anywhere else except for the one tiny little square of hog panel where his horns get stuck and I have to go dig them out every single day of chore time, I would, might choose differently now. So I think too, like, depending on it really depends on, like, if you have a dairy goat and you're going to be keeping them around forever, you're going to be milking them twice a day, right? Like, that's where you might say, okay, it's worth me disbudding them. I think the biggest concern is just making sure it's got to get done before they're a week old.
Great question.
Somebody mentioned too that if your kids are going to be sharing dairy goats in 4-H, they do need to be disbudded. Meat goats do not. So I definitely would encourage you to talk to your local 4-H educator if you're thinking about going that route, and just clarifying with them what you need. Also, one last pitch is that disbudding is not for the faint of heart. So if this is your first time doing it, don't do it by yourself. Ask your vet for help, ask your farmer friend for help. Don't try to watch a video online and do it on your own. This is something we would not ever recommend doing on your own if it's new to you.
Yeah. I mean, once you know the process, it's relatively painless for the goat kid. And the good news about bringing in a veterinarian, for instance, is that they can provide pain relief in addition to the actual process. So that's another debate that's going on, like how much pain are they feeling when you disbud, and having a veterinarian giving them a little injection of some sort of pain reliever prior to doing that procedure, then you eliminate all that. So.
Good question, though. It's like I said, it's like one of those like very polarizing debates in the goat community too. So
Yep. All right. So I'll finish this thought that I had before I was so rudely interrupted by my larynx not cooperating. Okay, so the riskiest place to get goats is from an auction or sale barn. The reason being, you have no idea where that goat's from. You have no idea why that person's getting rid of that goat. When we look at auctions or sale barns, we typically look at those as what we call terminal markets. So those are markets where, just say your whole business is purchasing goats, keeping them for a month, and then sending them to the processor, right? So maybe an auction's okay for you, maybe. But if you're keeping those goats long-term, there's a whole lot of diseases that you can introduce to your herd, which we're going to talk about in the next few slides, that are really hard to get rid of. And they're really painful and really a pain in the butt. And so for that reason, we don't recommend purchasing goats from sale barns or auctions unless they're going straight to processing. Okay. So here are some key phrases that will indicate that somebody who's selling goats is selling quality animals and they kind of know what they're talking about. An owner will typically say in their ad they have a clean or closed herd. If they say they have a clean herd, they should be able to produce documentation or provide documentation that lists the diseases that the animals are free from. Typically, they'll also say, well, these are goats that are this cross and they were bred for this purpose. They have been trained to this, they've been raised in this way. And those are people that are really wonderful, because then you'll be able to very quickly pick out whether or not that if those goats were raised to meet the management style that you plan to have on your farm. Sometimes they'll be registered, and sometimes they'll say in ads that their goats are registered. Sometimes they're not. And usually they'll have a reason for selling. A lot of times this is my annual crop of kids. I'm selling this many males and this many females, or this many bucks and this many retired does, for instance. And they should be willing to share pictures or discuss with you further. Buying sight unseen is risky business, and I highly recommend going and meeting those animals, or at least seeing where those animals are raised prior to purchasing. And something that Caitlin and I have talked about before is, if you're not familiar with raising goats, have a friend who is, or a farmer friend, come with you to these visits of farms that you're unfamiliar with to see if they see any red flags. And because buying a goat's a really big commitment. And so you want to make sure that you're buying quality animals that will meet your needs. Another way that we can look for goats and sheep is through the goat, sheep, and the Cornell Sheep and Goat Management Listserv. This is operated and maintained by Cornell University, and it is a legal way to post ads for animals, either wanted to buy or animals for sale. It is made up of farmers and farmers-to-be and veterinarians and extension folks and industry representatives, and it is wonderful. So in addition to ads that you can post for animals for sale, you can also talk about feeding strategies, or just say you have a kid that has, something's going on and you just want to bounce ideas off somebody else. This is a great place to do that. There are many hundreds of people on this listserv. It will fill your inbox, so I recommend having a separate email folder for it, but it's highly valuable. So this will be in the notes that we send you. You'll go ahead and you can click on that link and you can sign up to be on that listserv. So we're going to go ahead and launch a third poll just to check in and ask, how are you doing? Do you, well, I missed the third poll. So we can go through this one later. Let's go through this one later, because obviously I didn't click save when I entered the third poll. So you can in the chat though. Let's go ahead and use the chat. Let's just check in and see if you have gained some knowledge or skills so far. If you feel like raising goats is definitely for you or definitely not for you, that's okay too. You still want to learn some more stuff, or do you think you want to jump right in? And you can go ahead and think about that and pop your answer into the chat. All right, so it sounds like we want to learn more. I see a comment here, the listserv is fabulous. Thank you, Julianne. It is. It is great. Highly, highly recommend it. Yeah, I definitely want to learn more. Okay, thank you, everybody. Appreciate that. So we have more for you. Let's go ahead. We're not going to take a Kit Kat break, and we're just going to go into some of our videos. So this second half of the presentation is going to go over more in-depth things that you want to look at in regards to purchasing these animals. And I think at this point, Caitlin, I may have switched over the reins to you so that we could move back and forth and in and out. Or do you just want to go ahead and share your screen and cancel me out, and then I'll share my screen and cancel you out? How would you like to run this?
We'll share my screen.
Okay, that sounds good. So I will stop my share, because these are very video forward going.
Yeah.
Give
Give me just 1 second though to make sure that the PowerPoint comes up okay. Oops. Okay. Okay, so the first video that we have for you, as Amy mentioned, is just a general introduction to goats and talking about different parts. And this should go through. Give me a thumbs up, Amy, or, well, now I can't see you, so we're good. Okay, so here we go. We'll go ahead and get started.
So in this next series of videos, we're going to talk through the general health of a goat and ways that we can evaluate that. But before we get into some specifics, what I want to show you first is a generally healthy goat and how they should stand and how they should look and how they should act. So this animal is alert. She's bleeding to her little kid who she's got right here with her. And we can look at her face. We can look for things like nasal secretions. If she's got those, it might be indicative of disease. Just clear eyes, good hair coat. If we come down here, she's got pretty good body condition. She doesn't have any diarrhea or anything like that. She's standing pretty normal as well. Her teeth's nice and full. She doesn't have any signs of mastitis. And she's nice and plump. We don't see her rib cage. This is just a generally healthy animal. And this is what you want to look for when you're picking out a goat for purchase. All right, so we just looked at a doe, and now we're going to go ahead and look at a kid. Because if you are buying your first herd, it's likely that you might be buying kids rather than bred does or open does, which are does that haven't yet been bred. So this little kid is a pretty healthy looking kid. She's alert, she's active, she has a good stance, she doesn't have any signs of infection. Her face is quite clear. Her eyes are clear, her nose is clear, so she looks good there. One of the things that you might want to pay attention to are the horns. So on kids, they may or may not be disbudded. That means these horns are removed. Some folks like the horns, some folks don't, so it's going to all depend on your management style. And on a little boy goat, they may or may not be castrated. So that means they may or may not have their male parts removed in order to prevent unwanted pregnancies in goat herds. So with this little kid, I think she's pretty healthy and she's pretty large, so she's good to go. The next, so in this next series,
The next slide, Amy, that you have is on doing a 5-point check.
Yep.
It's just that my screens aren't
That's
doing
okay.
what I need them to do. So give me just 1 second.
We're fine. So what I'll do is, how about I just talk through a 5-point check? So yeah, so Caitlin's got it up there, but it's essentially you're checking 5 points of the animal to make sure that they're healthy. And I'm not going to go into this too much because we'll go ahead and shoot over to the video. And Caitlin, what I'll do is I will go ahead and pop up the slides and just introduce the next video so that you don't have to put up the presentation.
the next point of the 5-point check is going to be checking the eye. And the reason why we're checking the eye is the eye membranes. Of course, the eye should be clear and free from discharge. That's just to make sure that the animal is generally healthy and doesn't have an upper respiratory infection. If the eye is cloudy, it could indicate that the eye might have a condition like pink eye. But generally speaking, the main reason why we're looking at this is so that we can check the animal's anemic state, or whether or not she's anemic. So if you'll come over here, we'll take a look a little closer. And this is one way to do it. There are multiple techniques, but I'm just going to show you, if you're looking to buy a goat, this is just a very easy way to do it. So you go ahead, pull her lower eyelid down, and you can see the color of the membrane right in there. See that? That's kind of a light pink. So she's a little anemic. That should be a nice, bright, deep pink if she had all of her blood cells, but this little girl might have a little tiny bit of parasites, which can happen to goats. It's very common. One of the reasons why we check for health conditions through a test called FAMACHA, which we can get into another time. But this is going to indicate to us whether or not she's very anemic or not. Animals that are very anemic will have a white membrane. That means that there's very poor blood flow, bringing oxygen and nutrients to the rest of her body. And animals like that, you should think about maybe not purchasing, just because they're less thrifty and a little less healthy than others. So this is a young doe, and we're going to do a check on her eyes as well, just to show you and see if there's a difference between these two. So she has been on milk for most of her life. She's just transitioning to solid feed at this point. And we're going to come in and take a look at her eyelids and see how she's doing. So if we pull this down, that's much darker. See how nice and dark that is? That's probably where we want to be in terms of lightness of membranes. If it's a little lighter, it's okay. If it's darker, that's really okay. But she's good to go.
And one thing I want to interject quickly before we start this next video is that method of checking the eye membrane is very crude. Please do not say that that is the way to FAMACHA check your goat. So there's a process called FAMACHA. It is a certification program you can go through to learn how to pop the goat's eyelids properly so that you can truly check for anemia. But in the test that I was showing in the video, I basically wanted to say, okay, if it is solid white, that goat is a problem child and you don't want to buy it. If it is pink, you're good to go. So I just wanted to make that distinction before we moved on further. If you're interested in FAMACHA, reach out to your local extension office and see if they're offering a training near you.
The next part of the goat that we're going to look at is the jaw. And you might be thinking, why are we looking at the jaw of a goat? Well, the reason is in goats that have a high parasite load, they can develop a condition called bottle jaw. And it's just what you think it is. The jaw kind of distends and acts like a bottle and fills with fluid. And it's because the animal can't recycle the fluid in her body properly because of the parasitism. So when we look at a goat like this, good goat. So we see that she's got a pretty straight line jaw. I can feel her bones pretty well. She's good to go. Now, if she had bottle jaw, this could be extended as far as maybe down here, and it would feel like a water balloon. But with her, she doesn't have that condition. So that's what we're going to look for on the jaw of the animal. The next check that we want to look into is the hair coat. Hair coat's going to change a little bit over the year. It could be shedding out, like this time of year goats will be shedding out, and they might lose clumps of hair, but generally the hair is going to be pretty sleek along the body. It's going to not be patchy. It's going to be full and thick. And sometimes, and we'll see a goat in another image that will show a shedding goat, but this one has a really nice full coat of hair. It means she's healthy. It means she's digesting things the way she should, and the nutrition that she's consuming is going into that hair coat. We just looked at a younger goat, and so now we're going to make the comparison to an older goat. Sometimes there are folks that get rid of older breeding animals because they might not fit their specific breeding situation that they've adopted over the years, or maybe they just want some new blood in their lines and they're looking to get rid of some good animals, but they're a little bit older. And so let's look at the hair coat of an animal that's a little bit older and the body condition, because this can look different from a younger animal. We're going to be looking at the same things, but there are a few differences. So we're going to do hair coat first on this animal, and you can see she's a little less shiny, a little more rough, and that's not necessarily indicative of anything other than age. We can go ahead and look at her eyes and check for anemia to make sure that it's not related to a nutritional imbalance caused by anemia. And we look down her coat, she is shedding. So this is her winter coat that she's shedding out. This is nothing to be alarmed of. It's perfectly normal, and it doesn't indicate anything other than it's spring. And if we come in a little bit closer, I'm going to be looking through her hair coat because she does look a little patchy, especially down this back end, and we can see her skin poking through. So I'm just checking through, looking for lice, because sometimes that can cause hair loss. And I'm not seeing anything. There's some bits of chaff in here from the hay mow where she's pulling hay down on herself, but nothing that would indicate that she's got eggs of lice or lice running around. So she's okay to go that way. And it's likely then that the hair that she's missing is due to age and not due to any adverse condition. We're going to talk about body condition scoring.
Yeah, so hair coat is a really good first general indicator of goat health. If you walk up and you see really bad looking coats, this may indicate that there's something going on. There is a picture that Caitlin's going to show of a non-normal coat. So this is a goat that we found on our travels around Western New York. And this animal, unfortunately, had a pretty bad lice infection. And you can see it's annoyed him to the point of where he has used the bars of his pen to rub his hair off. You can see he's got this little line of hair along the back of his spine where he can't reach the, rubbing. But otherwise, this goat was put on some anti-parasitics by the veterinarian, and he did make a full recovery, which was really impressive. So if you see an animal like this, I would steer away from it just because you don't know what exactly you're bringing onto the farm.
We're going to talk about body condition scoring of goats. And the reason why this is important is because goats that are too heavy could lead to breeding problems. It could lead to some metabolic issues. Goats that are too skinny could have a disease process going on, whether that be parasites, whether that be some sort of other bacterial or viral disease. And we just want to make sure that when we're looking at a goat to purchase, that we're evaluating this as one of our main ways to see the health of the animal. So as we look at this goat's body condition, our main focus is going to be on the back of the animal, so right along here. This is indicative of the fat layer that the animal has on its body and helps us determine how much fleshiness it has underneath that fat layer. So what we are going to do is look at the pinnacle of the back along the spine, and we're going to see if it forms a triangle or more of a rounded appearance. In goats, our body condition scores are 1 through 5, with 1 being a really skinny goat and 5 being a really fat goat. Generally, we want something around 2.5 to 4. This animal, by looking at her, we can feel the spine, but we don't feel each individual vertebra. So that indicates that she's probably above a 1 and above a 2, because she does have some fat cover on here, and her muscling is pretty filled out along that spinal process. I would say, based on the fact that I can feel the spine, but not the individual indentations of the vertebrae, she's probably around a 3 or so. And that's expected. So she's been nursing a young little goat here for a little while now, and so she's lost some condition naturally just through the fat that goes into her milk. But for a nursing mama, she's doing pretty good. So in the next video, we're going to show you what a different goat of a different body condition score is.
All right, and go.
Oh, do it again? Okay.
Do it again, sorry.
That's okay. We're also going to compare the body condition score.
Sorry. You're right on top of things. I just wanted to take a moment to explain what I was doing with my fist. So there is a test that we do to determine body condition that we say, make a tight fist. If you, this represents the top of your fist here, represents the spine of the goat. And if you can feel the individual vertebrae as you feel the back of your hand when your fist is clenched tight, that animal's a little on the skinny side. Now, if you go ahead and open your hand all the way, so that this is very, well fleshed out as much as it can be, that's going to be a pretty fleshy goat. And so you want to close your hand about halfway, and that's about the spine of a goat that's at a body condition score of 3. So somewhere nice and right in the middle, generally on the not too fat and not too skinny side. Thanks, Caitlin. We can go ahead.
Also going to compare the body condition score of an older animal, such as this one, to a younger animal. And maybe that's not the best way to say that comparison. We're comparing two goats. Generally speaking, older animals don't keep condition on as well, simply because of age, but they can still look pretty good, and we should be able to pick out the ones that look good if we're going to go ahead and buy these older animals. So when I check her for body condition, I'm going to use the same procedure that I used for the younger goat, where I'm checking down her spine, just to feel the flesh that's there. And I'm also checking down the middle of her spinal process to see if I feel individual vertebrae. And I do. She's a little leaner than the other one, but not by a whole lot. So she kind of feels like if you just clenched your fist lightly and ran your hand along the bump, it feels kind of like that, rather than the smoothness of the back of your hand if you let your fingers out, which we felt on the other goat. So with her condition like that, she's still got a good amount of fleshing around either side of her rib cage here. And we do feel a little bit of the spinal processes. So together, I'd call that score about a 2.5 or so. So she's a half a score down from the other goat that we saw. Not unhealthy by any means. One thing I want to draw to your attention is she's shivering, and that's out of stress. That's not due to any illness or anything like that. That's just her and how she is. So if you do see that on a goat, I wouldn't worry too much about it. She's probably just a little bit of a drama queen. The next point of the 5-point check is going to be looking at the rear of the goat. And the reason why we're doing this is to determine how formed the feces is. Feces of a goat should typically be little round pellets, kind of like what we see here on the ground. But if this is more liquid, less solid, or it smells really bad, or the feces is actually spilling down the back and the legs of the animal, this can indicate that the animal has is parasitized. So we can take a look, we can lift the tail, and we see that her feces is perfectly normal, perfectly formed, and her rear end is clear. There's no feces running down her legs, so she's good to go for this check. One of the most important parts of a goat is its feet. Foot health can really help a goat thrive. If a hoof is healthy, if it doesn't have sores, and if it's clipped properly, that goat will be able to move without pain and will be able to access feed and water readily. When we look to pick up a goat foot, the front foot and the back foot are going to be picked up differently because of the way that the goat's legs are structured. So let's start with the front foot. So what we'll do is we'll not scare the animal. The animal knows that I'm here. We'll reach down, and because the front leg bends backwards, she'll cooperate with me. Come on. I know. We can go ahead and lift up the foot like that. This foot is really nicely clipped. So the way that goat hooves grow is they'll grow out, and they'll also grow from the side walls in over the hoof. If you see that growth over, that doesn't necessarily mean that the hoof is in bad health. It just means that it needs a little bit of a trim. So that's something to look at when we look at goat hooves. And they should be relatively flat so that they can walk on surfaces evenly. When we're looking at the hoof's anatomy, we also want to make sure that there's no foot rot or foot scald. And what this looks like is blisters, and you can find that in between the clefts of the hoof right here. So if we take the hoof and split it apart, we see that there's nice hair coating, there's no blisters, nothing leaking, nothing yucky looking. This is a healthy hoof. So now we're going to talk about how to lift a back leg and check the foot on the hind leg. And the reason why we're doing both legs separate is because they functionally work different ways. So with this leg, it was pretty easy because we could just go ahead, lift at the knee joint, and it bends backwards, and we can look at the foot pretty readily. But with the back leg, it bends the opposite way. So instead, we kind of need to do a lift and curl technique with the bottom of the foot. And here's how we do that. So we want to make sure that her weight's on her other leg because we are taking her off balance by lifting this leg. And we can go ahead and lift. So this follows the joint naturally, how it would turn. And then we can go ahead and tilt the hoof back, and that's how we're going to see what's going on. So if we come over a little bit closer, we can now go ahead and look at the hoof and see that it too is pretty healthy. So we don't have any sort of blisters or ulcers here between the toes. There doesn't look to be any differentiation of the tissue. All the hair looks good. And the hoof is really well trimmed. So this hoof wall is trimmed down flush against the bottom of the foot. And the tips of the hooves are also short where they need to be. So this is also a healthy foot. One of the other things that we want to look at when it comes to leg and foot health is how the animal's standing and how they're walking. For animals like breeding bucks, this is going to be really important since they're going to stand on their hind legs to do breeding. We want to make sure that they're really sound and flat-footed and they're putting the proper weight on those back feet. If there's an injury to the foot, that could result in the animal not putting weight on, and they will usually reveal a funny gait. They are prey animals though, and because they're prey animals, they're going to try to hide some of their symptoms, but if there's a condition that's severe enough, we might be able to see it. And we have a goat here that we know has a foot lesion, and so we're going to have Caitlin walk her just a little bit, and we'll see if you can pick up on that foot lesion. Of course, she wants to walk her own way, but please pay attention to her back left hoof. Do you notice how she's holding it forward a little bit? She's not putting weight on it. She's not as flat-footed on that hoof. That means that there's something amiss here, and something that we should look into more carefully. Now, it could be something like a foot lesion that could be easily cleared up, but it might be something like hoof scald or foot rot, which we might not want to purchase an animal with that condition. So that's one of the things that we should consider when we're looking at a goat herd in general and selecting individuals that we want. Okay. So this goat, once we lift up her foot, and Caitlin's going to do that for us using the technique that we showed earlier, we can see that there's a very sore lesion in here. Now, this isn't hoof scald or foot rot because it's not in between the toes, but it is something to make her uncomfortable. We do see a little bit of blood, a little bit of weeping, and this is just painful for her to step on, which gives her that uneven gait that we saw in the video a little while ago.
Okay, so that was a lot of videos. They will all be linked in the presentation that we send you, so you can go ahead and look at those on your own, should they have not come in clear for you. And if they didn't, we apologize. We try to keep our bandwidth low by turning off our videos, but sometimes it just doesn't work. So we appreciate your patience if you're one of those folks. So I'm going to skip over the 2 slides that go over foot scald and foot rot, simply because we talked about it in the video, and I want to pick up with quarantining animals. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen back. Oops. Is that right? I think that's right. Go ahead and share that.
We're getting slide view, and now it's presenter view. I've got it up if you want it on mine.
One sec. I can. Okay, that better?
Yep, you're good to go.
Okay. All right. Woo, 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 woo. We're going to go through all those. Okay. So quarantining new arrivals. Some things to keep in mind is if you're transferring goats across the state, you may need a certificate of veterinary inspection. That is essentially a veterinarian having come into the goat herd of the previous owner and saying, hey, everything looks good. You have a certificate to transport this or these animals across state lines. In addition, each animal needs to have what's called a scrapie ear tag or USDA assigned ID tattoo. And these just help for the tracking of animals and helps in the scrapie eradication program in the United States, and it's required by law. As you're going through and making decisions about purchasing these animals, some things to double check are first vaccination status. There are some diseases that are vaccinated for to help the animals thrive. And so ask the previous owner what they've been vaccinated with and if they need any follow-up boosters. The health status, again, should have been confirmed prior to movement. And another thing to talk with the previous owner about is deworming program or the status of worms on the farm. And we talk about parasites a lot here. That's because parasites are one of the leading causes of death in goats across the US, but they're a huge problem in New York, as well as many other states. And so it's really important that folks that keep goats are maintaining consistent deworming protocol, that it is an appropriately effective protocol, and that they know the status of their herd. When you bring new animals home, you'll want to keep them separated for at least 3 weeks from any goats that you may already have. And this means completely separate. So an area where they can't go ahead and interact with the rest of the herd. And you'll keep typically separate footwear so that in separate tools. So when you're working with one group, you don't have to transfer those tools and footwear across to the other group, so that if there's something there, it's not spreading. During that time that you bring that new animal to the farm, you're going to go ahead and do everything to minimize the stress for the new arrivals. Stress usually invokes some sort of disease response. So if there's something brewing beneath the surface and it didn't show up at the old owner's farm when you bring it home, and just say it starts sneezing or it starts limping or something like that, it may be that the stress of the movement has depressed its immune system enough so that you can see some of these disease issues come to light. And if you do, you can go ahead and treat them. Of course, provide booster vaccines should they need them. And then you will check all of your animals when you get them home, if you can, if you know how, for anemia scores and deworm them. If you don't know how to do this, again, recommend a fellow goat herd to help you with that. Before you integrate those animals that you've just purchased with the animals that you currently have on your operation, now they've been separate for 3 weeks in this scenario up to this point, you're going to go ahead and check each animal on both sides for signs of disease. And once you confirm that there is no disease present, you can go ahead and integrate them together. Now, there will be some scuffles as they assert dominance and reorganize their hierarchy. And sometimes you may have an animal that falls to the bottom of the pack, and that animal may need some extra care from you. So just keep an eye on that, the weaker animals when you're doing the integrations. Make sure that the newbies have enough room to escape. So sometimes they'll get chased off by the more dominant animals that have been in their environment for a long time. So making sure that there's enough room for everybody is really important when introducing new animals. And that is all I have before we jump into some financial considerations. So with that in mind, Caitlin, I will turn it back over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Amy. So in order to fund my farming habit, I have this day job of being an extension specialist, and my specialty is farm business management. So I help farms with the paperwork side of things. So I call it paperwork, people, and hopefully a profit management. Depending on your goal, right? Like what you're raising goats for, whether that's for hobby or for personal use, or for business, we can still apply the same principles across the board when it comes to considering the finances of raising goats. So when I'm working with beginning producers, we try to first clarify what's the goal and what's the purpose, right? So if goats are a hobby for you, that's great. You treat it just like a dog, right? You buy the dog food. We don't expect our dogs to make us money back. They bring us joy most days. So goats are very similar if you're raising them as a hobby. If you're raising them though as a part of your farm business, right? Particularly if you're operating your farm business as a business that is, filing taxes, keeping accurate records, XYZ, it does elevate and change some of the decisions that we have to make when it comes to raising our goats, deciding, which goats we're going to breed, which ones we're not going to breed. And now my windows are getting messed up again. Okay, there we go. And so that's typically the first thing that I ask and have everybody clarify. Next, we consider what's the market, right? So Amy was talking about before that when you're selecting breeds, a lot of times that could change based on your market. If your market is dairy production, where are you going to send that milk? If your market is cheese, what permits do you have to get to make cheese, right? If you're looking at meat goats, are you selling direct to consumer? Are they going to auction? So kind of clarifying what your market is ahead of time, that will help you when it comes to making decisions. And then finally, I ask, what's the plan, right? So how are we going to get from where we are right now to where we want to be, and coming up with a way to do that? It doesn't mean, and it typically means that it absolutely will not happen that way, but having an idea in mind with a few backup plans is all part of the business planning process that we take part in as farmers. Included in the slides that you're going to get as a follow-up are some really great resources that I use when I'm working with farms that are maybe currently a hobby and they're looking to expand into a farm business. The first one is called So You Want to Start a Farm Resource Directory. I'm a little partial to this because Amy and I put this together and it's really, really good. So it's kind of a roadmap of all of the resources that are out there for beginning farmers. Cornell Small Farms Program puts together a guide to farming in New York State. This is exceptional, updated every year, every other year. And then also some additional resources on business planning and marketing. So we have another poll just to kind of see, I think I just got to relaunch it just to see what we shape up as a group. So we want to know, why are you interested in goats? Are you looking at raising goats as a hobby, raising goats as a business, or still not sure? It's amazing too how your hobbies can sometimes get overwhelming, and there's definitely this pressure of if you have a hobby that you enjoy, you have to turn it into a side hustle, right? And that's not always the case too. So please don't feel like we're putting pressure on you to start a farm as a farm business. Okay, I'll go ahead and end this and share out the results. Looks like we've got a good mix. So pretty even. So we've got a group of hobby folks, group of business folks, and a group of folks that still aren't sure. So if you are still aren't sure, if you're in the still aren't sure bucket, I definitely would encourage you to reach out to the me of your region. And if you don't know who the me of your region is, let us know and we'll get you in touch with that person. There's some questions that you can consider when you're thinking about transitioning from a hobby to a farm business. And those questions can either talk you out of it or talk you into it really quick. So briefly, I'm going to share some information about record keeping. We bring this up right from the beginning because you should start thinking about how you're going to keep records and what records you're going to track as soon as you're getting started with producing goats. There's a few different kinds of records that you should be tracking, and I would definitely encourage you to track these records even if you're operating as a hobby and you're not operating as a farm business. Except for maybe the financial part, right? Like maybe we don't want to know about that, but the other sections, they can still help you with managing your herd, making sure that your documents are up to date and making sure that you're making informed decisions. The first type of records that we keep track of are inventory records. These note, monitor, track the supplies that we have on hand, right? So if we keep ear tags on hand, we might have an inventory or an idea of how many ear tags are left, for example. Other inventories are keeping track of your animals, how many animals you have of what different kinds, and your counts of your crops. So how many hay bales you have in storage, how many bags of feed you have in storage. The thing with inventory is we recommend tracking it at least once a year, right? But we really should be checking in with it on a regular basis so that we know, for example, how much feed we need to order. We know, for example, how many bucks we have that we could possibly be selling. So speaking of animal inventory, there's some detailed information that we should be keeping for each animal. So we definitely need to track tags and the descriptions of the email, particularly if we're using scrapey tags. We want to make sure that we're attaching that tag number to an animal, where that animal came from, if it was born at home, if you purchased it from, and which grower did you purchase it from, and when did you purchase it, the birth date, the parents of that animal, so that we can avoid inbreeding, so we can track productive does, productive bucks. If you do any medical interventions or treatments, you'll want to keep accurate records of those too. So anything that's going in the animal's body or anything that you're doing to the animal's body, you need to track that. This is so that we don't have things like milk and meat residue. If you're vaccinating, you can track to make sure that everybody's getting their boosters when they need their boosters. I also tend to note too, like if I notice that a goat has a cloudy eye or a runny nose, I'll mark that down for them, even if I don't treat it. But then a week later, if they pop up with pink eye, it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to double check everybody else. So that as soon as I start seeing cloudy eye now, in conjunction with my vet, I'm going to start preemptively treating for pink eye. Because other things that you can think about too are keeping track of when you're hoof trimming, for example, if you notice anything while you're hoof trimming. If you notice that maybe somebody doesn't have foot rot or foot scald, but something doesn't look right and you want to check it later on, that's another thing that you should keep track of. Vaccinations, you should work with your herd veterinarian to decide what vaccination schedule is the best for you. If you're showing goats, you definitely need to meet the minimum fair requirements, but there are other things that we can vaccinate for based on our herd's needs. And then breeding and kidding dates. So when you put does out with bucks, which bucks did they go to? When did you put them out? When did those animals kid? I sometimes keep track too, if you're doing blood samples to test for pregnancy or having somebody come out and ultrasound, you'll want to keep note of that as well. So then we consider tracking records related to crops. Anytime that we're purchasing or producing crops, how much did we buy? How much did we produce? Thinking about fertilizer, lime, and pesticide applications, and then dates of seeding, harvest, or other applications for your crops. The other thing too that isn't on this list, but particularly too, if you're purchasing crops and you do like preemptive forage sampling, you'll want to keep a record of that. If you do any soil testing, you'll want to keep those records. And then finally, the part that nobody likes, but I have an entire job devoted to it, is financial record keeping. I think it's still important to consider financial record keeping if you're operating as a hobby, less necessary, right? If you're operating your farm as a business, then this is absolutely crucial. At the bare minimum, you need it for taxes. At the best, you need it to make sound financial decisions that are informed for you. So when we think about financial record keeping, when it comes to goat production, we need to consider all of the incomes and expenses associated with raising those goats or the farm as a whole. So incomes include sales of milk products, for example, hair products, anytime you sell an animal, insurance payments, custom labor services, and then expenses would be feed, crops, vet, processing, and any shared expenses amongst other animals on the farm or within the business as a whole. If you are interested in looking more into the financial record keeping, we've got several recorded presentations and presentations coming up in the fall. So please don't hesitate to reach out and we can help get you connected with some more resources for that. And then finally, I wouldn't be a good extension professional if I didn't mention risk management. So farming is a risky business. And as farmers, we are going on this journey, accepting the risk, but there are several things that we can do to prevent risk or manage our risk as best we can and consider it. So we've got production risk related to how we're producing the animals, human risk related to how we're going to keep people on our farm safe, marketing risk, how are we going to sell these animals at a price that's going to earn us a profit, legal risks, what are we going to do to avoid liability, any contracts, business structures, and then financial risks. So how can we make sure that we're managing the money associated with this farm business, with our goat production, in a way that's going to continue to earn us a profit. And then again, the resources that we reference, these will all be in your handouts from tonight. And I think now, Amy, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen one last time. Okay. Going to buzz through these slides because Caitlin did a fantastic job of covering risk management and financial business management in 15 minutes, 30,000 foot overview for sure. And definitely something that I encourage you to look more into. We encourage you to look more into if you're looking to do this as a financial, as a little more than a hobby. So I'm going to go ahead and throw up our learning poll 5. And so this tells us a little bit about what you learned today. So there's 3 different questions, so please scroll down. And we would like to know, again, this is all anonymous, and we won't go ahead and share this with the group. This is just for us. So did you find today's presentation helpful? Second question is, I have more questions about goats, yes or no? And then the third is a multiple choice and it's topics that you'd like to learn more about. And let's see if we've got them all. So I will go ahead and let that run. And in the meantime, I want to throw in a shameless plug for our other presentations that we've got coming up here. Tomorrow night, same time, same place, exact same link that you used to get in tonight. We're going to do health and hoof trimming. So we're going to take a deep dive into hoof health. And you'll watch Caitlin and I wrangle some more goats and some more videos and use some very sharp implements to make the hooves look pretty and be functional. Then we're going to talk about pasture and parasite management on Monday, May 8th. And then we'll talk about kidding and reproduction, including what to have in your kidding kit and signs of labor and all of that fun stuff on May 9th. That presentation is called Baby Mama Drama, but we did not have room to put it in the slide. So we're calling it Kidding and Reproduction. Okay, so thank you to everybody who answered our poll. I'm going to go ahead and end that. And we'll keep those results there. And I want to open it up right now in these last few minutes to see if you have any questions for either Caitlin or myself.
While you're all thinking of your questions, if I can get this to work right, I had a really fun surprise when I went to do chores the other day. Let's see if I can just in case you were wondering about if goats are for you, this might tip it one way or the other. Hopefully. This is one of our mama goats that got her head stuck in the chicken feeder. I didn't let her suffer for too long before I went and helped her, but and this was not horn related. This was just her.
For being greedy.
Yep. She snuck out of the goat pen. We always joke that the only goat fence that's useful is an 8-foot concrete fence. So she snuck out of the goat pen and found her way into the chicken coop. So okay, so it does look like we've got a few questions. One is interested in how to find a reputable breeder and a herd veterinarian. So Amy, you want to take first stab or you want me to?
I'll say reputable breeder is going to be along the lines of asking folks that you know who have goats and have their recommendations. It's reaching out to that sheep and goat management listserv, and seeing, you know, who comes up and sorting through that based on what you want. Because reputable is, do they keep records? Are they willing to share information with you? Are the goats that they're selling, do they look good? Like, that's all part of their reputation. So I would say that there's a lot of reputable breeders out there. It's just finding them. In terms of veterinarians, now that's a little more challenging. So we actually have a directory that we're working on that has a list of veterinarians in Southwest New York. So that'll help you if you live in our region. If you live in a region other than Southwest New York, I recommend reaching out to your local extension office. They may be able to help you with a list of large animal vets in your area. The good news is, well, there's good and bad news. Bad news is that there's fewer large animal vets than there need to be. The good news is that means that a lot of these vets, once they do their initial appointment, may do telehealth with you. So as long as you have that annual herd check and health check, many will be willing to, like, you could send them a picture and talk about symptoms and they'll be like, oh yeah, it's this, and here's a treatment regimen, right? So there's some flexibility there nowadays. It's not as good as having a vet there all the time when you need it, but it's a really close second. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Caitlin, but.
No, I don't think so. I think for a reputable breeder, if you really are struggling and are brand new, always just call your local extension office. Even if you can just get to the list of, 4-H breeders, right? They might be registered cattle. I'm a cow person. I'm very sorry. Registered goats that might be like higher quality than what you're looking for if you're starting a commercial herd, but it at least gives you a name. So if you are struggling with just getting that first name, start there and start calling around. If you know a goat farmer that you really admire, ask them. And even if they're not selling, they're going to know who in that community might have goats available for you. Okay, how much older was the older goats in the video? The oldest goat, kind of the scraggly looking one, she was 10, which is old for a meat goat. And I think, unfortunately, I don't think she made it another breeding season after we had filmed those videos. And she was also a mom that she was not a good mom. So every time she kidded, I would go pull the kids, but she did a really great job with having multiple breedings within a calendar year. So it was like, I think I texted Amy about 20 times trying to decide what to do with this mama goat. But unfortunately she didn't make it, but she lived a very long, happy life. How to treat that hoof problem that was shown. That one is also an interesting question. So the hoof problem that was shown, the hoof that was not hoof rot but had the small lesion on its sole. Originally, when Amy and I were doing those videos, we thought that it was just like a puncture wound, right? So she was out and about, had stepped on something, that was it. I connected with my vet, and following her guidance, we trimmed it back. So every few days I went out and trimmed a little bit more, and would wrap it in wound care, soak it in copper solution, kind of following all of like the check the boxes, and it ended up not being a lesion or a puncture wound. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's like extremely rare, and it's just an abnormal growth in the hoof, so there's no treating it. So following our vet's recommendation, what we ended up letting it do was we let that hoof grow long enough to fold over and protect that hoof.
The soft tissue underneath.
Yeah. So it kind of just does its own thing. We monitor her really closely to make sure she doesn't get hoof rot because that hoof is overgrown, but it's encasing it and protecting it and allowing the scar tissue to build up. All of that though was done with lots of texts to my vet because that was the first time I had ever seen anything. And when Amy and I recorded those videos, we were like, oh, this is just a lesion. Like, yeah, let's show this, right? And then it was like, oh, actually, this is not. But that's exactly what a lesion will look like.
Right.
So anything that's like within the hoof, typically that's caused by some type of injury along the way, unless it's really, really bad hoof rot, but then you're going to see it in the skin too. And usually those are treated by trimming the hoof back, soaking it in copper solution and wrapping it with some type of ointment or wound care and keeping a close eye on it. You'll also want to get any goats that have hoof issues off of muddy pastures. So if they're out on muddy pastures or unclean bedding, they need to be in a clean area, as clean as we can get it. So if I ever run into goats that have hoof issues, they come right in off the pasture because they're typically muddy and are on fresh bedding in a bedded pen. So that one should have been a simple answer, but it wasn't. It turned out to be a really fun story. Another question, do you have a good resource that has sheets we can print off for record keeping? I have multiple handmade notebooks, but would love to have a bit neater looking. We do have a few resources that we can share with you. I'll say from a record keeping perspective though, the notebook that's custom tailored to your farm will always be better than a one size fits all sheet because every farm is different. So when I've worked with folks that wanted something that was a little bit more simply laid out, I actually had them bring me their notebooks and then we worked together to kind of format their own sheets and print them out that way, which you can do on your own. You can work with your extension agent to put that together. But we can make sure that we're sharing some one size fits all resources for you to get started. We have a comment, finding a goat vet was a challenge when we first started, but I love the vet that we eventually found. It's a labor of love, but then you find them and it's a really good fit. Are there associations for goats with breeder lists? I know that that's
Yes.
how I found my sheet.
Yes. Yeah, there's the American Dairy Goat Association, which I showed, and I think there's the American. There's one for each of those groups, and I just don't remember the acronyms and the names right now because my brain's a little fuzzy at 8:38 p.m. But yeah, they do exist, and they do have breeder lists that they'll be willing to share.
If the mom doesn't want to take care of the kid, do you bottle feed the baby the mother's milk, or is there an alternative that you I would say join us at Baby Mama Drama.
Yes, we'll cover this in Baby Mama Drama for sure.
In general, you can milk the mom depending on the goat and how she's feeling. Milk replacer is a great option.
Yes, make sure it's milk replacer and not milk supplement. And if it's just born, if the kid's just born, it'll be colostrum replacer. You must feed colostrum. I say that like with a big must, right? But like you really should if you can, because it's going to give that goat the best chance of thriving as it grows.
Yes. Do we provide an e-certificate on this webinar? This is not a certificate earning webinar program, but if you need proof of attendance for any programs, just send us an email and we can provide you with a letter on letterhead.
Yep.
Amy and I always joke too that we just want to start our own like homesteader school, right? So eventually you'll see Caitlin and Amy Homesteader University certificates available for purchase.
Perfect.
All right. So I think that was all of our questions for tonight.
Yes.
Great.
You guys have been wonderful. Thank you so much. The questions really help these go by so much better. And if you have a question, somebody else does too. So we answer multiple questions at once, and it's a really great time. So thank you so much. We look forward to you joining us tomorrow if you can, and we will go ahead and send out this recording shortly. So thanks again, everybody, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.